Greetings, it is I, Tempest Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire. Welcome. It is time to continue with my expose on the history of Magic the Gathering. Today, I'm going to be talking about the 13th expansion released by Magic, Stronghold. This was the second set in the Tempest block of the Rath cycle, and it was the first small set in that entire block. Now, it was released on March 2nd of 1998, and it had a pre-release on February 21st of 1998. It had 143 cards, and continued all the themes they had had in Tempest. Slivers, Lycids, Flowstone, Spikes, Buyback, Shadow, but it also introduced the en-kor, which I will talk about a little later, what their abilities were. Now, its symbol represented the closed portcullis of Volrath's Stronghold. Now, this was the last set to feature multicolored cards until Invasion in 2000. So there was quite a number of sets that multicolored cards just weren't printed in. Now, this set also saw a resurgence in the ability to use walls properly. A lot of the walls from this set were actually quite useful and saw a lot more tournament play because people were like, oh, these are good! They aren't crap walls! The other thing is, this was the last set that the symbol on the set did not mark what rarity it is. Starting with Exodus, and from then on, the symbol was colored to match with the rarity. Black meaning common, a kind of gray meaning uncommon, and gold meaning rare. And eventually they would put red for mythic rare when those were introduced. Now, of course, it was sold in 15-card booster packs. The art on it was Warrior Angel from the set. And because of the massive popularity, much more than Wizards had expected, of the pre-made decks that were put out with Tempest, they put out another set of pre-made decks along with Stronghold. The only difference was because this was not made to be a set that was on its own. The pre-made decks included cards from both Stronghold and Tempest when they were constructed. The demand for these was much higher than Wizards could have ever anticipated. Now, the pre-release card was Refinement, and the story takes place that the crew of the Weatherlight is now diving into the depths of Volrath's Stronghold. They've managed to reach it and are breaking in order to rescue Captain Sisay and their other friends and recover the pieces of the legacy which are being kept there. The story culminates deep within an area called the Dream Halls, where Gerald confronts Volrath, learning that he was in fact the blood brother Vul, who he thought lost, who was actually Vul was behind the theft of a big chunk of the legacy that had set off the entire beginning of this quest. In the battle which ensued, Gerald wins and supposedly defeats Volrath, only to learn that he'd been replaced by some kind of imposter shapeshifter, effectively escaping death at the hands of Gerald, who kind of went for revenge there a little bit. Now, the themes were continued from the previous set, shoring up all of them, including giving a great boost to Slivers in this set, and giving a lot more spikes, so there was an entire set of spikes now, rather than just the one that had been before. They did introduce one other type of thing, the en-kor creatures. En-kor creatures were given an ability that was representing a replacement for the now defunct banding ability. For 0 mana, they could redirect a damage dealt to them, 1 damage dealt to them to another creature. But since it cost you 0, you could keep redirecting it for every damage dealt. This meant that they were effectively immortal if you had enough things to spread out the damage in amongst your creatures. Now, there were 3 cycles to this set. There was a cycle of allied colored slivers, that each of them were the 2 allied colors. They were 2/2s and gave a pretty decent ability to slivers. The second cycle was a cycle of Lycids, just as similar before they had a cycle of them. And the final one is a cycle of 2 mana cost walls. 1 colorless, 1 of the appropriate mana for the color the wall was in. These were all of them were pretty decent walls that were put out, and so it was a very important cycle to see. Now, the theme decks that were released were a white-black called Call the Core, a black deck called Migraine, a blue-red deck called the Sparkler, and a green-red deck called the Spikes. The set also included a number of reprints from Portal, including Venerable Monk. Now, let's talk about some of the famous cards or important cards that I feel were in this set. There was Mox Diamond. It was a 0 mana cost card that when you put into play, you had to discard a land from your hand, but it would tap for any color mana. It's one of the more expensive cards in the set. There's Sliver Queen. This was the first 5-colored creature ever. 5-colored card in general, so it contained all 5 cards, one of all 5 mana to play it. And it was a 7/7 creature that counted as a sliver. For 2 colors, you could put a sliver token into play. It was part of a very easy, at this point in time, infinite sliver combo, which I still use in my sliver deck. Combine this with Heartstone, which I'll talk about later, and Ashnod's Altar, where you could sacrifice a creature for 2 colorless, and you had infinite slivers. When I explain Heartstone, you'll understand it. There was Dream Halls. For Dream Halls, you could discard a card in order to cast a spell if the card you discard shared at least 1 mana color with the card you want to cast, and you'd cast it for free. So effectively, I have this blue spell I want to cast, I discard a blue spell, and I cast this blue spell in my hand for free. Now, any X's on the spell I'm casting count as 0. There's Ensnaring Bridge. Creatures with power greater than the number of cards that you have in your hand can attack. It's a good way of keeping very large creatures from attacking you if you're more of a small size creature-based deck. There's another expensive one, Volrath's Stronghold. It tapped for a colorless, or for 1 colorless, 1 black, you could take a creature card from your graveyard and put it on top of your library. There's Awakening. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, untap all creatures and lands. So everything was untapped every turn. There's Bottomless Pit. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, they discard a card at random. A good way of dropping cards from everyone, especially if you have almost no hand. There's Burgeoning. Burgeoning is when an opponent would put a land into play. If you have a land in your hand, you may put it into play. So whenever someone else plays a land, you can too. There's Constant Mist, with a buyback of sacrificing a land that creatures deal no combat damage. If you have a way to get lands back, it's not a bad card. If not, you can eat away at your lands in order to keep it in your hand. Krovax the Cursed. He'll become important in storylines later on, but that's why I wanted to mention him. He is a 0/0 that counts as a vampire, but when he comes into play with 4 +1/+1 counters. During your upkeep, you either have to sacrifice a creature, and then you put a +1/+1 counter on him, or if you don't, you remove a +1/+1 counter. So he grows or shrinks as you sacrifice creatures to him, and for 1 black, he gains flying. Flame Wave. It does 4 damage to target player and each creature they control. Grave Pact. Whenever a creature you control would be put into the graveyard from play, each of your opponents sacrifices a creature. This one is the basis for so many graveyard black decks. There are so many, even now, Grave Pact and similar cards to it really do that. I have decks that still have Grave Pact because it is so good for these reasons. It works in a deck where you're made to throw things from your play into the graveyard and force everybody else to lose creatures. Heartstone, which I was talking about. The activated abilities of creatures cost 1 colorless mana less to play, reducing it at least to 1. It cannot go below 1. That's where it comes in with that Sliver Clean combo I was talking about. Reduces the cost to 1, you sacrifice a creature for 2, then you can get 2, doubling them each time you sacrifice. There you go, infinite slivers. Then we have Invasion Plans. Creatures block when able, and the attacker chooses how creatures block. So that's a very interesting one. As long as your creatures are able to block, they do, and whoever's attacking you chooses how those creatures which are blocking block themselves. So they choose how you are blocking them. A little interesting thing there. There's Magrim. Whenever an opponent discards a card, they take 2 damage. That's a very good one for a discard deck, even today. Primal Rage. Creatures you control gain trample. That's pretty good that way, that you can play Primal Rage and give all your stuff trample. There's Volrath's Laboratory. When it comes to play, you choose a color and a creature type, and for 5 mana, you can use this artifact to put a 2/2 creature of that color and type into play. This is very early on one of the things that could create tokens of a type and color of your choice. There's, of course, Volrath's Shapeshifter. Volrath's Shapeshifter is a copy of whatever creature is at the top of your graveyard. So if there's whenever a creature is on top of your graveyard, it becomes a copy of that, though it retains all the normal abilities it has. So effectively, it still retains its ability to be a copy of something else and any other abilities it has, but it also is a copy of whatever top creature card is on top of your graveyard. It has the ability that you can pay 2 mana to discard a card of your choice from your hand. So you can be like, oh, I can't cast this creature. Oh, my Shapeshifter's a copy of it now. And the last one I do want to mention is Wall of Blossoms, because this is a quintessential wall for a lot of very fast green decks, or green decks in general. It was one of the 2 mana cost walls. 0/4, when it came into play, you drew a card. This was very good ramp for a green deck, because you get a blocker, and you get a card. Second turn, I have effectively just gotten out a blocker for free, and just drawing a replacement card that may really help me in the end. So it has very great uses and still could actually be pretty useful today, depending on the deck you build. So that's it for today. I talked about Stronghold. I introduced you to the set. It's continuing the storyline that was introduced in Tempest, driving our heroes into the depths of Volrath's Stronghold. I talked about some of the cards from the set and some of the mechanics that were expanding in the Tempest block, and introducing another one that is pretty interesting. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave it in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel, the Empire, and the work I do. And until the next time, I bid you farewell.